Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our EESI briefing this afternoon. My name is Carol Werner. I'm the Executive Director of the Environmental and Energy Study Institute. So glad that you all came. There is a lot of activity going on the Hill today, particularly in the Senate. I think probably everybody is aware that the Murkowski resolution is being debated and voted upon today. And this is part of the reason why we wanted to have a whole discussion today in terms of looking at public attitudes with regard to global warming, with regard to climate change and energy policy. Because as you have been following our briefings, you know that we have tried to look at a whole variety of technology, science, and policy issues that have been before the House and the Senate over the last year. And we have noticed so many times as we've been tracking what's been going on with regard to public opinion over the last number of years, that so many times there has been a lot of publicity focused on various polls that when you start to really dig down into them, that you find out that what is in the headlines or in a very cryptic summary is not necessarily exactly what happened. Or in some cases, you look at the question and you go, well, you know, I'm not sure that that was necessarily quite the right way because I would have had trouble answering that question myself. And so I think today is going to be a very interesting session. It's a real chance to hear from someone who has been doing a lot of work in this whole area in terms of really studying, analyzing other people's work, as well as being in the field and doing a lot of polling, looking at public attitudes directly. And so we are very, very honored to have with us today in terms of our opening presentation, Dr. John Krosnick, who is a professor in humanities and social sciences and a senior fellow at the Woods Institute for the Environment at Stanford University. John?
Well, thank you all for coming. It's really a delight and a pleasure to be back in this area and have the opportunity to share new work with you. And before we go any further, I do want to thank Carol very much and her amazing staff for working for months now to put this together in collaboration with folks from Stanford who have also made this possible. When we first booked this presentation a long time ago, we did not know that it would be possible to present to you brand new data that were collected just in the last few days. And for academics, we tend to study American public opinion on a relatively slow scale. Like, I'm perfectly happy to study data from the 1950s and publish about that because we learn about how people think and how they make decisions. But we've learned that in the news media and certainly in this city, the latest data are important. And especially when public opinion is changing, it's important to know the latest. And so I want to thank in particular the Woods Institute and the National Science Foundation here in Washington for supporting and making possible this very new data collection. In fact, we're poised to do 2 new surveys in the near future to track how public opinion develops and to look at how different ways of measuring it influences the conclusions that we reach. And so I'm grateful especially to NSF for their support of the work. What I'd like to do today is to give you a taste of the research findings from the newest survey, but also to put it in some context from earlier work. And before I start, I think it's important for you to know a bit about who I am, what my background is, what my methodology is, and what my goals in being here today with you are. So first of all, this project is done under the umbrella of the Woods Institute for the Environment. The goal of the Woods Institute is to conduct and disseminate high-quality science to inform policymaking and advance basic research. And those are definitely 2 different goals. I will tell you every time I write a question or do a statistical analysis, I'm trying to accomplish both, to produce something of value to policymakers and also to help us advance our understanding of how people think and make decisions in the domain of politics. So this is very much an exploration of the psychology of political thinking of the American public. Now, the method that I'm using is one of many that political psychologists use in this particular study, and it is the method of survey research. And survey methodology is, in fact, a well-established science. Back in the 1970s, surveys were barred from court just as the polygraph is barred from court now. But in a key decision in the 1970s, courts recognized that survey science was a well-established methodology that could produce reliable results, and as long as one follows the principles, one can produce the same results over and over again and validate them. And I'll just give you one little sense of this. You've seen lots of this yourself, but if you want to ask yourself, well, surveys, should I really pay any attention to them? You might remember that recently we held a presidential election in this country, and as you can see on the left-hand side, Mr. Obama got 53% of the vote, and Mr. McCain got 46% of the vote. If you average together the final surveys that were done immediately before the election, their results are 52-45. You can't get much better than that in survey research. Now, obviously, in an election like 2000, where in some places it's just a hair-breadth difference between the winning and losing candidate, you need a very large survey sample in order to nail it. And typically we are not doing samples that big. But in this particular case, as you can see, the surveys, as they always do these days, did quite well. Now, my goals in telling you about this work today are to use the survey method to help Washington understand the nation and to advance our understanding of how democratic publics form and change their opinions. So to put this in context, I want to tell you about the messages that I think legislators have been receiving about the public's will on climate change. And I will tell you, before coming here today, I spent yesterday and today meeting with elected representatives and their staff to learn about how they think about this issue. And one very heartening message that I got is that elected representatives care a lot about what the public thinks. That's terrific. Those of you who work in these offices know that already. For me as a person who doesn't, it's always reassuring to hear it over and over again. But the question is, how, in fact, do they learn about what the public thinks, and what impressions do they have? Well, one potential source is a very respected outlet, the magazine called Science, that said in October of 2008, the strong scientific consensus on the causes and risks of climate change stands in stark contrast to widespread confusion and complacency about the public. Among the public. If Science says that, I wouldn't blame a legislator for paying some attention. But it turns out not only did Science say that. In addition, in October of 2009, the nation was blanketed with headlines that looked like this. U.S. belief in global warming is cooling. Americans' belief in global warming cools. Kind of cute, isn't it? Public more complacent about climate change. U.S. public still unconvinced on climate change. Concern about climate change waning. Bear with me, there's a purpose to this. Poll finds Americans more confused about climate. Notable drop in Americans' belief in global warming. Fewer Americans believe in global warming. Skepticism over global warming on rise, poll suggests. Fewer Americans convinced about climate change. Global warming believability drops in U.S., and Americans no longer swallowing global warming dogma. These are respected news outlets in this country. Said that over and over again to constituents and elected representatives who work in this city. Now, in light of that, given that everybody's busy and there's only so much time to read into the details of a news story, and there's even less time to read the details of the methodology of a poll, you can see why people in this town might have said, you know what, I think the public might be cooling on this issue. In particular, if you did read in, this is the kind of thing that you saw. This one happens to come from NPR. A new poll shows a big jump in the number of people who doubt the reality, the cause, and the risks of global warming. Reality, cause, and risks. Now, let's talk about, just for a quick second, what are the categories of purported change that I've just shown to you in all those quotes? Well, the first one is the very existence of warming itself. So one of those headlines saying fewer Americans believe in global warming. Second category is certainty. Poll finds Americans more confused, or fewer Americans convinced. So it's maybe not about how many people believe what, but rather how sure they are. And the third is concern, or priority. Concern about climate change waning. Now, in our work as academics, those are three very different things. You can believe in something but be uncertain. You can be concerned but not know what to believe. And yet, these assertions all summarize that poll as showing all of these indicators of engagement and rationale for action decline. So in October of 2009, it's understandable that maybe now was not the time to pass climate change legislation. But in fact, if you look at those categories again that I just showed you, were any of those actually measured in the survey that caused all of this? Was belief in global warming's existence, or certainty, or concern? Well, let's look at the polling data that caused the whole thing. Here's the result. In 2008, 71% of people expressed a particular point of view, and in 2009, 57% of people expressed that point of view, which I'll tell you in a second. Now, that in the polling world is a very dramatic short-term drop. We are used to the American public sitting pretty stably over long periods of time unless something huge happens like the September 11th attacks that grab everybody's attention and give us a very new message about the world we live in. Did something like that happen in 2008? I don't think so. So for me, when I saw this result, it seemed a little hard to believe. And when you look at the question, you realize that it's a very different kind of question than you might have imagined. This is from the Pew Research Center. From what you've read and heard, is there solid evidence that the average temperature on Earth has been getting warmer over the past few decades or not? Okay? It's a perfectly fine survey question. But it focuses respondents on what they have read and heard, not on what they personally believe. It asks about solid evidence, and it focuses on the last few decades. Now, most natural scientists who study climate change would say that the process has been happening in the last few decades, but it's a much longer-term process than that. A decision was made in this question wording to focus on this particular time interval. Might it have made a difference? Well, for me, the key takeaway from this question is it's fine, and I don't mean to suggest that that result, 71 to 57, isn't real, but I do want to suggest that we need to be careful that this question doesn't directly ask, what do you believe about whether the Earth has been warming up? And it certainly doesn't ask, how sure are you, or how concerned are you, right? So the extensions that happened from this one survey question were dramatic. So let's think for a second, what might have caused that decline in perceptions of the scientific evidence from 2008 to 2009? Well, an obvious, plausible explanation, and I will tell you, after this poll was announced, I was quoted in the Associated Press article talking about it, saying, gee, I find this a little hard to believe. And so I got a bunch of charming emails from people saying, what, are you kidding? This is not hard to believe. Finally, the skeptics are getting some traction with the American public. So we have been involved, among other things, in conducting a content analysis of news coverage of this issue, where we gather every single news story that mentions global warming or climate change, and then we subject it to statistical analysis. And let me show you what we're seeing. So first of all, this is just simply a little glimpse into the volume of attention to this issue between 2000 and 2009. So these are print news stories. And as you can see, these, 5,000 a year is a pretty good number of stories back at the beginning. But the peak, absolutely, was in 2007, with a bit of a decline. So you can imagine that by the time 2008 and 2009 come around, that seems like certainly less coverage than there had been before. But there's certainly no sense in which the issue has disappeared from the agenda. But what did those stories say? Well, we counted up how often a climate skeptic was quoted in those news stories in each of these years, from 2006 to 2009. This is the percent of stories quoting a source as asserting that the Earth has not been warming up. And what you can see is essentially no relationship over time at all. 9% in 2006, down to 6% in 2009. The skeptics certainly did not have a loud voice in mainstream media coverage, though they certainly may have been heard on the blogs. And that is certainly not a notable enough change to have caused a change in public opinion. Of course, you want to take this number in the context of the next slide, which is the percent of stories quoting a source saying that the Earth has been warming. And look at this, 86%, 80%, 68%, and 78%. Aha, 68% in 2008. So down from 86 to 68, that is a notable decline. And if you compute the ratio of this slide to the last slide, what you see is that in 2008, the skeptics actually did kind of have a louder voice. The ratio of people saying the Earth is warming to the people who are not is the lowest in 2008, but not dramatically. Hard to imagine that that little decline in the ratio would cause a dramatic change in people's thinking. So I want to say at this point, the change from 2008 to 2009, if it did happen, is a mystery, maybe a decline in confirmatory messages. But a decline from 2009, when that survey was done, to now is not so hard to imagine at all for the following reasons. First of all, in late November 2009, you remember that the ClimateGate emails were revealed. The University of East Anglia emails between climate scientists that have been purported to show collusion to silence climate skeptics. Secondly, you know, since then, the IPCC reports have been criticized for including information that people said were questionable. And lastly, in December, you can think about what happened in Copenhagen as a success, and many people do, but others say that that meeting was envisioned to produce an international treaty and it failed to do so. And Anthony Downs, an economist and political scientist, a long time ago, 30 years ago, proposed something he called the issue attention cycle, in which he made the following assertion. Once a nation recognizes the existence of a problem and begins to try to solve it, if legislators don't take action immediately, it sends the message that it's not really a pressing problem after all. Otherwise, they would have done something. If there was a meteor heading toward Washington right now, Bruce Willis would be up in a spaceship immediately to get rid of it. But in this case, if we can't sign a treaty in Copenhagen or elsewhere in the past, then maybe this is not such an important problem after all. So the proposal here is that people think if this were really a pressing problem, leaders would have reached an agreement on a solution. Lastly, was there any snow in Washington this last winter? It was a cold winter in a lot of places. Snowy winter, thank you. So the question then is it possible that that influenced people's thinking as well? So let me now show you something about the results that we've gotten from comparing a late 2009 survey to a mid-2010 survey to compare those opinions and perceptions that people shared with us. Now, the surveys we've been doing, as I say, stretch back to 1997. We always interview representative samples of American adults drawn randomly. Our surveys typically interview people either by telephone or on the internet. When we do it by telephone, interviewers have extensive training and they're supervised very closely. And I lose lots of sleep in order to design balanced, unbiased questions. An important feature here is that the surveys are never described in advance as being about global warming. If I called you up and said, hi, I'm calling from Stanford University, we'd like to interview you about your opinions on global warming, people who are turned off by the issue for whatever reason will hang up their phone. So we tell them that we're calling to ask about various public issues in discussion. The newest survey involved data collection between June 1st and June 7th, 2010, done by telephone. It was done by GFK Roper Public Affairs and Corporate Communications through their office based here in Washington. And I just want to take a moment to acknowledge some heroes who worked very hard to make sure these data were available to you today. Anna Vilar at Stanford stayed up many late nights. Nicole Spalda, who works here at GFK, stayed up some late nights. Everybody else at GFK worked very hard, and Josh Pasek at Stanford helped us do statistical weighting for the data. So let's look at some results from this survey. First of all, let's see what happens when we ask the Pew question again. What do people say about what they've read and heard about solid evidence? And this is what we see. So the Pew result from 2008 was 71%. The Pew result from 2009 was 57%. In our latest survey, that number is up statistically significantly from October to 62%. But the gap is certainly not gone. Something happened in there to affect people's perceptions of the science. But that, of course, is not necessarily what people personally believe themselves. So we'll turn now to what their personal beliefs are. And before I tell you how we do this measurement, I want to show you how we don't do this measurement and to illustrate some other surveys' approaches to this. So here's one poll that measured personal beliefs this way. Imagine you're on the telephone. Recently, you may have noticed that global warming has been getting some attention in the news. Global warming refers to the idea that the world's average temperature has been increasing over the past 150 years, may be increasing more in the future, and that the world's climate may change as a result. Do you think that global warming is happening? Okay, so that's a long question, and it's got some interesting features, right? So in this case, it says the world's average temperature has been increasing over the past 150 years, so it picks a bit of a longer time frame, may be increasing more in the future, so these verb tenses are a little funny, and that the world's climate may change as a result. So this is what we call a multi-barreled question with lots of moving parts at once, and then asking for a single answer in the present tense. So it's talking here about the past, the future, and then it asks, is global warming happening? Now, from our point of view, maybe knowledgeable about this issue, it's not completely preposterous. This is a package of beliefs that many natural scientists would endorse. But to ask Americans their opinions on this, it's very important to separate out the moving parts. Here's another example from a different survey. If you had to choose, do you believe climate change is really occurring? Is it definitely occurring, probably occurring, possibly occurring, probably not occurring, or definitely not occurring? In this case, the use of the phrase climate change, undefined, runs the potential risk that people might define that term differently and might misinterpret it to mean the weather changes from day to day. So our approach is to define it a little bit more. Here's another one. Do you believe the theory that increased carbon dioxide and other gases released into the atmosphere will, if unchecked, lead to global warming and an increase in average temperatures or not? So if global warming is not an increase in average temperatures, what is it? It's left a little bit unclear, right? So this is, of course, a question focused only on the future, that it will lead to in the future. Or another one, very simple. Do you believe global warming exists? Without a definition. Let me show you a couple of questions that are a little bit, I think, more informative, but here's a pretty burdensome one. Which of the following statements reflects your view of when the effects of global warming will begin to happen, right? So if you stop right there, it sounds like it's a question about the effects, right? But if you read the answer choices, they have already begun to happen. They will start happening within a few years. They will start happening within your lifetime. They will not happen within your lifetime, but they will affect future generations, or they will never happen. Now, again, bear in mind, this is being asked over the telephone, so it's a bit of a burden to hold all that in mind. But if somebody says they will never happen, you might be tempted to infer that they think warming is not happening. But, of course, all they're really saying is something about the effects of warming. Nonetheless, when you look at the results from Gallup, and in 2008 and 2009, 65% of people said they thought the effects had already begun or will begin in a few years. So just those top two answer choices alone is a notable majority that shrunk in a small way from 2008 to 2009. Here's the last other question I'm going to show you, this one from CNN, even more of a mouthful. Which of the following statements comes closest to your view of global warming? First, global warming is a proven fact and is mostly caused by emissions from cars and industrial facilities such as power plants and factories. Second, global warming is a proven fact and is mostly caused by natural changes that have nothing to do with emissions from cars and industrial facilities. Or, global warming is a theory that has not yet been proven. So one of the things that could be improved about this question is it doesn't offer the fourth option, which is global warming has been shown definitely not to be occurring. And it's important to offer all possible points of view. But if you look at the CNN result from 2008 to 2009, you see 76% of people said they thought it was a proven fact in 2008, and 68% said so in 2009. So the point of the Gallup and CNN results here is you see majorities of people, even with these somewhat burdensome and foggy questions. Here's our question. You may have heard about the idea that the world's temperature may have been going up slowly over the past 100 years. What is your personal opinion on this? Do you think this has probably been happening, or do you think it probably has not been happening? So we try to focus in particular on that 100-year period that our natural science advisors told us was the optimal one, and we talk about the world's temperature going up slowly over that time period, and we asked it in a balanced way. Between 1997 and 2008, these are the percentages of people who said they thought the world probably had been heating up. So I think I want to propose to you this is the most direct and well-defined question of the set I've shown you. And the number began in our first national survey at 79%, rose up to the 80s in 2007. By the way, these are three different surveys, April, June, and September, all in the same year. And look at how similar those results are, 84, 85, 84. If somebody tells you, you know, you do the same survey twice, you get completely different results. No, actually, you do the same survey 3 times, you get exactly the same result. And in 2008, we saw a 4 percentage point drop. What happened in 2009 and 2010? I'm going to now just begin with 2006 and average 2007. And here's what we see. From 2008 to 2009, a 5 percentage point drop. And these numbers, 80, 75, 74, are essentially equivalent in statistical terms. So the key point here is, if somebody tells you America's cooling on climate change, well, yeah, I mean, it used to be 84, and now it's 74. But 74 is a gigantic number in America. It's very hard to find issues on which 74% of Americans agree about anything. Now, I'm going to put this in that overall context to show you all the years from 1997 to 2010. There was, in fact, a rise in 2006 and 2007, perhaps due to that big increase in media coverage that I told you about. But it's certainly not disappearing, that 3/4 or larger majority. Now let's turn to the next issue. What's causing it, right? Because some people might say, oh, yeah, the planet's heating up, but it's natural. It's nothing caused by humans. So our question here is, let me explain, skip this for a second. Do you think a rise in the world's temperature is being caused mostly by things people do, mostly by natural causes, or about equally by things people do and by natural causes? Now, it's very important to offer all three of these opportunities, right? Because if you just ask the first two, you're forcing people to make a choice that they might not naturally make. They might like to select this third option. The parenthesis here was included for people who said they thought climate change probably was not happening. We still wanted to know, ask them, if it was happening, what do you think the cause would be? And so the question was changed to use that verb would. And this is what our results look like between 2006 and 2010. Over that time period, essentially a consistent sizable majority, 80% saying human activity was responsible, and today it's at 75%. So if you want to talk about declines happening between 2009 and 2010, this is an instance in which the number went up slightly. I wouldn't make much of it myself, but it is an instance in which it went up. Okay, how about the overall evaluation? This is what psychologists call attitude. This is our question. Scientists use the term global warming to refer to the idea that the world's average temperature may be about 5 degrees Fahrenheit higher in 75 years than it is now. Overall, would you say that global warming would be good, bad, or neither good nor bad? Now, the way that question is phrased, it encompasses all kinds of elements, right? It's not only a question about is it good for lizards or is it good for humans? Is it good for the economy? Is it good for ingenuity to inspire people to find new ways to make energy? Any basis on which people want to make a judgment is open there. And so one argument people might make is that a crisis like this causes a country or a world to wake up and innovate in important ways, and I see that as a good thing in the end because I'm optimistic I think we'll handle it. In this case, what you can see is that 60% of people said they thought global warming would be bad in 1997, and that number is essentially the same today. So again, over a very long time period, there have been little ups and downs, but nothing dramatic in terms of that. In our new survey, we asked a question for the first time about people witnessing the effects of global warming personally. Only for people who said they thought global warming probably was happening, we said, do you think you have seen any effects of global warming happening already, either in person or through television, radio, newspapers, or magazines, or do you think you haven't seen any effects of global warming in any of these ways? And what we found is that 82% of this group said they thought they had, and we have asked them about what effects they think they've seen, and we're in the process of analyzing those data now. When you multiply this 82% by the 74% who think it's happening, this tells you that 61% of the nation believe that they have seen effects of global warming already. Now let's turn to a favorite topic for Washington. Should the federal government do anything about this? Well, we asked a series of questions that allow us to measure whether people think the federal government should do more, less, or what it's doing now to deal with this problem. And from 1997 through 2010, you can see a sizable increase, even a larger increase in the late years of the Bush administration. One possible argument here is this number has declined because, not because people want less action taken, but because people want the same action to be taken once President Obama was elected. And in fact, the numbers do not indicate any rise in the percent of people saying less should be done, but there's a sense in which, for most people, they would like to see actually more effort devoted to this problem. Now, let me just pause for a second to play a little psychology game with you. If you look back at this picture, right, what you see is an upward trend, right? But what if we turn the clock back to 2008? What if we were then looking at those same data and we got rid of these two bars here? What would you see? I bet you would see that. There's a natural tendency to connect the dots and to say, I think a new trend is happening, and before we know it, we're going to be down to, in just 2 years, down to 42%. And in fact, maybe it's like a ski slope. Maybe it's going to actually accelerate even more. But what happened? Well, that's what happened. We didn't see any ski slope. The numbers came into a flat line. So I just wanted to show you this to caution you not to overly interpret either an increase or a decrease and presume it's going to go anywhere past where you can see the data right now. Okay, so what I've told you is that a majority of Americans want government to do more on this issue. What do they want government to do? Well, we asked a series of specific questions. First, having to do with limiting air pollution by businesses. Here's the wording. Some people believe that the United States government should limit the amount of air pollution that U.S. businesses can produce. Other people believe that the government should not limit air pollution by U.S. businesses. What about you? Do you think the government should or should not limit air pollution by U.S. businesses? Think about that for a second. How many people will endorse that? 86% of Americans. That's a lot of Democrats, Independents, and Republicans. You can't get a percentage that high without a lot of agreement. When we asked in this new survey, not about, as you can see here, air pollution, but rather greenhouse gas emissions in particular, the same exact question, but here asking about limiting the amount of greenhouse gases thought to cause global warming, we find 76% of people say they think government should do that. Everybody. Yeah. So one way to think about it is, I told you earlier that 74% of people think it's been happening. So just about all of them, and a couple more people think government should limit greenhouse gas emissions. Here are some other questions about policies that we asked. We asked about whether government should either require by law or encourage businesses with tax breaks to do a series of things. First, that power plants manufacturing electricity should reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Secondly, that Detroit should build cars that are more efficient, use less gasoline. Third, that construction folks should build houses and offices that use less electricity to heat and cool. And that appliance manufacturers should build appliances that use less electricity. And if you look here, dating back to 2006, you don't even need to figure out which line is which. They're completely on top of each other. 80% of the full sample, 80% endorse government effort in each of these areas. Here are some other remedial policies that we asked about. Here we asked about whether the federal government should provide tax breaks to produce alternative energy. And you can see 87% as of 2007. 87% of the full sample favoring that. Should tax breaks be provided to nuclear power plant construction? Well, that went up a bit from 41 in 2006 to 54 in 2009. It's held essentially steady. It's 51% now. And two policies that people like the least are essentially manipulative. These are policies that I take to be ones that follow directly from a particular economics philosophy that says if you want to get people to use less gasoline, increase the price. If you want to get people to use less electricity, increase the price. And so the way we described this in this survey was to say, would you favor or oppose government slapping a tax on gasoline just to get you to drive less? No comment about what would happen with the revenue that was generated. And as you can see, only 28% of people, which is actually maybe a surprisingly large number, said they like that idea. Increasing the price of electricity to manipulate people into using less of it, only 22% of people favor that. So those particular policies did not appeal to people, but, and in some sense, if you think about it, the only thing that's guaranteed there is that people pay more for gasoline and electricity, right? There's no guarantee that anybody's going to use any less. And if you look at what happened when gasoline prices went up dramatically in America, we didn't see dramatic declines in consumption. So there's every reason to imagine the only benefit the country will get out of this is just spending more in their bills for gasoline and electricity. What about green power sources? Well, we asked a question in particular about whether the federal government should give tax breaks to utilities to produce more electricity from wind, water, and solar power. 87% favored that. And when we asked, should power companies be required by the federal government to make at least 20% of their electricity from wind, water, and solar power, 69% said the government should impose that mandate. What about cap and trade? Well, unlike some other surveys you may have seen, I get a little uncomfortable when I think about just simply asking people if they've heard about cap and trade and what they think of it. I think it's complicated enough that it's important to explain it. So we did. Here's our explanation. We said there's a proposed system called cap and trade. The government would issue permits limiting the amount of greenhouse gases companies can put out. Companies that did not use all their permits could sell them to other companies. Companies that need more permits can buy them, or these companies can pay money to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that other people or organizations put out. This will cause companies to figure out the cheapest way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Would you favor or oppose this system? 65% in favor. Now, in some other research, we explored what's the reluctance of the other 35%. And one of the principal themes that we heard from people was, this doesn't sound like it's going to work. Has anybody ever done this before? So half of the respondents in this survey were asked this question. Half of the respondents were asked this question plus 2 more sentences. This type of permit system has worked successfully in the past to reduce the air pollution that companies put out. For example, in 1990, the federal government passed a law like this called the Clean Air Act, which caused companies to put out a lot less of the air pollution that causes acid rain. When we reassure people on that score, approval goes up to 74% in favor. That's, again, a very large number. Now, during this time period, I will tell you from the first survey we did in 1997 to 2010, the American public feels more and more informed on this issue. So when we ask people, how much do you feel you know about the issue? 42% of people in 1997 said they thought they knew a lot or a moderate amount. And that number has increased steadily over time to 68%. So the public, at least, is feeling pretty well informed with information backing up the opinions that I showed you. Now, before I wrap this up, I want to give you 3 quick bites of dessert, all having to do with priorities. So in other words, a very reasonable question for legislators to ask is, okay, this is all very nice. I see that there are remarkable majorities of Americans who share a point of view on this issue. But how important is this to them? How high of a priority is it for them? Because we have a lot of important issues to deal with. Very reasonable question. And let's begin with a look at this from the lens of a question that George Gallup himself invented in the 1930s that asked people, what do you think is the most, let's see, I'll show it to you right here. What is the most important problem facing this country today? Okay? So it's a very nice, simple, pithy question that gets asked in lots of national surveys and is used as an important barometer of the public's priorities. And when that question is asked these days and in our surveys, the economy, not surprisingly, is most popular. Lots of other topics get little mention. And in our particular survey, 1% of people mentioned global warming. It was in last place, ahead of the other category, which had 6. So this is the kind of message that says, no, there are a lot more problems that Americans would like this government to be working on before they work on that. But let's look closely at that question wording again. There are a couple of key aspects of it. First, what is the most important problem facing this country today? Okay? Now, it's natural to say, yeah, the economy is obviously the #1 problem facing this country today. But are Americans really only interested in their government focusing on problems that are uniquely American and problems that are uniquely facing us today with no look to the future at all? Well, maybe not. Maybe people think in bigger terms. So we tested out a different version of this question where we said, what will be the most important problem facing the world in the future if nothing is done to stop it? Very simple. So half the respondents get the traditional question. I just showed you the results. The other half get this question. What happens? Global warming and the environment are now in first place by a large margin. Now, you say, wait a second. All you've shown me is that when you ask this question, that's the most common answer that people give. But you haven't shown me anything to indicate that people actually want government to work on future problems that affect everybody else. Isn't it possible that Americans just say, solve my problems today, right now, and we'll deal with the future when the future comes? And certainly we have enough to deal with in this country. We don't need to deal with other countries. So we asked a very relevant question. How much effort do you think the federal government in Washington should put into dealing with the serious problems the world will face in the future if nothing is done to stop them? Okay? What kind of answers do you expect to get from this? When you combine a great deal and a lot together, those top two categories on this 5-point scale, 76% of Americans say they want that substantial amount of effort. So the key point here is that with this new indication, there's a very different message conveyed about the priorities that Americans attach to this particular issue. Next bite of dessert, does language matter? You no doubt know that there are experts on both sides of the aisle, Frank Luntz particularly on the Republican side and George Lakoff, well known on the Democratic side, for advising that the words politicians choose to describe and frame issues can have tremendous impact on how Americans think about those issues. And I want to just show you a little excerpt from a strategy memo that was distributed pretty widely. Mr. Luntz said, it's time for us to start talking about climate change instead of global warming. Climate change is less frightening than global warming. While global warming has catastrophic connotations attached to it, climate change suggests a more controllable and less emotional challenge. So by shifting to climate change, the proposal here is this will reduce the apparent priority that people attach to the issue. So in our experiment, in a national survey, we asked half of the sample, selected randomly, if nothing is done to reduce global warming in the future, how serious of a problem do you think it will be? The other half were asked the same question, simply replacing global warming with climate change. And when we first analyzed the data, the result that we saw is the following. So think for a second, just bet in your own mind. Are you going to bet people think global warming is more serious than climate change? Climate change is more serious than global warming? Well, the answer is no difference. So 29% here, 27% here, rating each of these two problems as extremely serious. And this is just one way to analyze the data. No matter how you analyze it, there is no difference in the average ratings of the issue. But it turns out, when we submitted this work for publication and reviewers comment on it, they said, hey, try this other analysis that we hadn't done, and it turned out to be very useful. Because when you look underneath the surface, look what we found. We found that when you asked people about global warming, there was a notable partisan split between Democrats and Republicans. Only 10% of Republicans said it would be extremely serious, whereas 45% of Democrats said it would be extremely serious. But when we asked people about climate change instead, the Republicans came up, the Democrats came down, and now the partisan gap still present was from 15% up to 35%. So interestingly, by moving to this language, Mr. Luntz's advice actually reduced the partisan split. It disarmed a bit the Democrats and energized a bit the Republicans, and these are both statistically significant changes. So you want to think about these things when you make language choices, and collecting data like this is a good way to test out what impact it actually has. Now, the last look at priorities involves the pressure that the public puts on government, and in particular, is there an election coming up sometime soon for people here? No? In the fall, maybe? So how does any of this play out in voting? Well, we now know from 30 years of research that it plays out in voting in a very different way than many experts think in terms of how Americans vote. Each issue that people could base their votes on actually has impact on only a small fraction of voters. So there's a group of people who care deeply about gun control, and they are going to vote based on that issue no matter what. There's a group of people who care deeply about abortion, and they're going to vote based on that issue no matter what. And it turns out there's a group of people who care deeply about climate change. Those are people who we call the issue public, to differentiate them from the general public. And these are The activists, these are the people who make contributions to lobbying groups. They're the people who go to town hall meetings and scream. They're the people who write letters and make phone calls to editors and of newspapers and to elected representatives. And they are the people who walk into the voting booth and cast a vote to reflect their preference on this issue. Now, the problem with this issue public concept for most campaigners is that issue publics typically are about evenly divided between people on one side of the issue and people on the other side of the issue. And so if you vote this way, you win half of them and you lose half of them. If you vote the other way, you win half of them. You lose. It's really hard to put a coalition together on most issues. But as it turns out, not so here, and I'll show you a little bit of background. First of all, how big is this issue public? Well, we asked people how important the issue is to them personally, and we focus only on people who put themselves in the very top category, in the extremely important category, which was 8% in 1997, grew to a peak of 18% in 2007. By the way, that, of course, was the year of the really amazing number of news stories. And it has fallen a bit to 15%. Now, as it turns out, the eye is connecting those dots, right? And you see that decline. But none of these numbers are statistically significantly different from each other. I cannot reject the hypothesis that this is actually flat during this time period. We'll see what happens in coming years. If there's a number here and a number here, we'll conclude that this was just random sampling error. So I'm a little reluctant to say that's a drop. But nonetheless, 15% is about typical for most of these issues. And I'll show you this in some context. A year ago when global warming was at 16%, the biggest issue public we've ever seen was for abortion in the 1990s at 31%. But issues like unemployment, race relations, women's rights, capital punishment typically get small groups or even smaller groups of people who express passion about them. And the strange thing about the climate change issue public is that from the beginning, it has been nearly unanimous in supporting ameliorative action. So I'm showing you these numbers from 2006 to 2010. What percent of the issue public thinks the planet's been heating up? As of now, 88%. Caused by human action, 88%. Government should do more, 84%. So if a candidate comes out saying these things, and essentially everything else that I've shown you that attracts majority support in the survey, they will gain a lot more votes than they will lose. Okay, just a quick little coda and we're done. What I've shown you is that there has not been a dramatic decline in support for policy or in belief in the existence of climate change. In fact, there's been no decline in support for policy at all. But there are people who have said there has been, and they've said so based on claims that the East Anglia emails and the IPCC reports and maybe the failure of Copenhagen contributed to a sense in which maybe people don't trust climate scientists anymore. And I can show you results here. First of all, we've asked people how much do you trust the things that scientists say who study the environment. And between 2006 and 2010, the folks who say they trust them completely, a lot, or a moderate amount has held very steady at about 70%. There is no sense in which that number is lower now than before those revelations occurred. And when you analyze the data a little bit differently, completely or a lot only, there's again just a flat line. And the same thing happens if you analyze each category separately. There is no sense in which Americans have lost confidence in climate scientists any more than they had lack of confidence before. Did the ClimateGate or IPCC errors cause problems? Well, in this survey, we asked people a series of questions. First of all, hey, do you remember in the last 6 months hearing anything about emails sent between scientists who study the climate? And a majority of people said no. About 30% of people said, yeah, I think I heard something about emails. And when we said, well, what do you remember hearing? A good chunk of them said, I don't know. I mean, I've heard about some emails. I don't know what they were. And then we asked people, did those emails suggest to you that climate scientists should be trusted, should not be trusted, or did it say nothing to you about whether they should be trusted? And as it turns out, only about 10% of the country said that they thought these emails indicated to them these climate scientists should not be trusted. And these are mostly people who didn't trust them in the first place. Similarly, when we asked about purported errors in the IPCC reports, when you multiply it all out, about 10% of people said they knew about it and that it led them to question the reliability of those scientists. So it's not so surprising. Okay, take-homes. First, before number one here, survey science is not such a terrible thing. It's actually a method to produce numbers that if you repeat the study over time, you can see very similar results that I would hope you would view as some evidence of reliability. And this method has led us to see, for a period of over 10 years, huge majorities, really remarkable majorities in this country on this issue, sharing a perspective, and evidence that there are lots of votes to be gained and almost no votes to be lost if representatives from either party endorse the points of view that the majorities of Americans endorsed here. Lastly, I hope that our little walkthrough survey questions leads you to a perspective that says maybe best not to just read the headlines in the future, and maybe best not even to read the news stories. If you want to make something of the polls, click on that little PDF link and read about the details. And you can do that for our poll as well. There is a website at the Woods Institute website devoted to the surveys that the Institute has supported for our research team. And there is a report up there showing all these questions and all these numbers if you'd like to scrutinize them slowly. I'm going to close with a little humor. One last headline I'll show you, this one that hit me most powerfully, from my beloved San Francisco Chronicle. The headline said, "Survey finds more doubt global warming." And the story begins, "A small but growing number of people doubt that global warming is real, according to a new poll." How long ago was this, do you think? It was today, describing my survey. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. That was a fascinating walk through both your data and also the analysis in terms of looking at what is going on with regard to public surveys overall. Our next commenter is Mark Cooper, and we had wanted to have someone who had done a lot of work, who comes from a consumer background, be able to, who has also done some work on polling and analysis with regard to energy policy, to comment a little bit with regard to Dr. Krosnick's work here and the presentation of his latest polling. And so at this time, I would like to introduce Mark Cooper, who is a senior fellow with the Institute for Energy and Environment at the University of Vermont Law School. Mark? And then we'll open it up for discussion with the audience.
Well, since I've just seen the results, I'm going to pick up on one of the headlines from the press release that I got yesterday. And I am going to, John challenged one urban legend about the decline of interest support for climate change. I'm going to challenge another urban legend, which really struck me in his press release, and it was very stark in the presentation. And that's this urban legend that the public wants to lower energy consumption, but they don't want you to raise their prices. And as a result of this, we get the argument from it drives the economists batty, right? It drives the environmentalists batty. We get the argument that the public is just inconsistent and they don't understand the implications of what they want, and it's a complex. We have all this demeaning of the public when they express this set of beliefs that is contradictory to the economic theory. And of course, in an age when we hear that Washington has lost touch with the people, this is a case where the people, it is argued, have lost touch with reality. As you can tell from my headline, I take the opposite view. The people have it right. That set of beliefs is actually consistent not with economic theory, but with economic reality. And so I'm going to wander through a series of slides, and we've been doing public opinion polling on gasoline specifically, and I'm glad I didn't put all my questions up there because I think there would be some criticism of some questions. We use global warming, but actually we do try hard on these questions. We asked people how concerned are you about, and gasoline prices, Mideast oil dependence, and global warming. We use global warming. And we've been doing that for 5 years. And what we find is a fairly high level of, a very high level of concern about prices, a high level of concern about Mideast dependence. And you notice we don't say Mideast imports, because the United States doesn't import a lot of oil from the Mideast, but we are dependent upon Mideast oil because it structures the market. I mean, we do try and be careful about this. And then we use global warming, and you see less concern, but again, almost across the board, at least the majority of concern over these 5 years. The interesting thing is that over this period, the price of gasoline has gone from $1.60 to $4, back down to $1.50, and now it's around $2.80, right? So the price is up and down, but the concern has been fairly consistent. So the American public has not been fickle in its expression of concern. Again, consistent with what John said on this specific issue. Okay, so they're concerned. What do they want to do about it? And this is the most recent question. We've asked lots of questions about what do you want to do about it. And what we find is that almost 90% of the people say we have to reduce our oil consumption. This time we've asked them a very aggressive question on fuel economy. Should we raise the fuel economy standards for cars and trucks to 50 miles per gallon by 2025? The Obama administration has just recently announced 35 miles per gallon by 2016. We're at 27 today, so 50 by 2025 is a pretty aggressive goal. We've asked this question in different ways over the last few years, and what you get is almost two-thirds of the people supporting this goal. Again, high-level support, and interestingly, low-income people are more likely to support it than upper-income people. And we find this difference consistently. We've also asked people about other policies, and what's quite clear here is, and it's consistent with what John found, people want information about miles per gallon. They want it on their stickers. They want it on their dashboards. There's always been very high support for fuel economy standards. This is a general number. This is a general question, so we didn't give people the 50 miles per gallon. This is a general question, and we get almost 80% support for increasing fuel economy standards. When you ask people about gasoline taxes, and the way we phrase the question is, should the government establish a gasoline tax to set a floor of $4 a gallon? And this was when the gasoline prices were high. And we tell them it will be recycled. So, of course, we want it to be neutral. You get almost half will support that. That's a larger number than John found. But this is very specific and very, we've worded it differently. Looking at various incentives for carpooling, or looking at fee-based, that is, charging people higher fees for low economy, fuel economy cars and lower fees for high economy cars. California has a proposal like this. And you do see this really big difference between information and standards and the incentives and taxes. So the question is this an irrational response by the public? And my answer is going to be no. And the way I like to get at that answer is the following question, or the following approach. It costs 10 cents a kilowatt hour to consume a kilowatt hour of electricity in America today. The National Research Council tells me I could save it for 3 cents. It costs, the other one I use is gasoline. The price of gasoline is projected to be about $3 a gallon over the life of the current cars coming off the assembly lines. The EPA and the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration suggest we could save that gasoline for about $1 a gallon. So in America today, people are spending 3 times as much money to consume energy as they could spend to save it. In a capitalist economy, when something is important, cheap, and plentiful, you would expect them to buy more of it. Why aren't these people buying more energy efficiency? And this has been true for 30 years. And what makes you think adding a couple cents a kilowatt hour to electricity or $1 a gallon to gasoline is going to make a big difference? People are already leaving more money than that on the table. And the answer is energy markets are imperfect. They don't work very well for a variety of reasons. Price is an inferior policy instrument in energy markets. And I have a 100-page paper, which we filed at NHTSA, if you want to see it, explaining 30 years of research into why energy markets are imperfect and failing. It is one of the most obvious, blatant cases where markets don't work very well. And here I've distilled out some of the reasons why price is a poor policy instrument. So the public kind of knows that when you raise the price, you inflict a lot of pain on them, but they're not in control. Sometimes they don't buy the appliances, sometimes they cannot cut back. For a variety of reasons, the market doesn't work very well. And so their reaction is actually the correct reaction given the energy markets in which they live. Here I put up my analysis of market failure for efficiency in building markets. I have another one in the gasoline market, so I cover both. But the simple fact of the matter is that the people are right and the economists are wrong. And that is, in a certain sense, consistent with the previous findings. And then, of course, I'm a standards guy. And the people have overwhelming support for standards. It turns out standards are a neat way to address all those market imperfections. And so I prefer standards. I'm not against taxes, but the front line of defense ought to be standards, my opinion. And I think the public opinion polls are consistent with that. Now, I do a couple things, and I don't want to take too long, but one thing I like to do is I like to compare electricity consumption per capita per dollar of output. And when we do gasoline, we've got this problem of we have a low-density continental economy, so you can argue that there's big differences between America and Europe, for instance, because they're a very dense place. But when you do electricity, it's not a density-related thing. Since we consume it in our homes, and how tightly packed they are matters a little bit less, a lot less. And what we observe, of course, is that the United States, per dollar of output per capita, consumes 50% more than what I call continental Western Europe. That is, France, Germany, Belgium, not using Eastern Europe, etc. So it would appear that people can have a decent standard of living with a much higher level of efficiency. And the American public actually believes that. I want to add two more things, because they're really good points from John's slides. We actually did a split half set of questions away. It's a neat trick that most survey researchers never do. You never see the Gallup or Harris splitting the sample and asking the questions. We asked a question about people's knowledge about the U.S. energy situation. And we asked them, what percentage of the world's oil do we consume? And what percentage of the world's oil resources do we have? And of course, the right answers are we consume about 25%, and we have about 2% of the reserves. Now, interestingly, we asked how much we import. And interestingly, the American people get the import number right. They get the reserve number wrong. They think we have much more than we actually have. And over the last 5 years, they've gotten worse. And they've been hounded by drill, baby, drill. They thought that drill, baby, drill was we would solve our problem, and they were told it. And so they doubled their estimate of how much reserves we have. The interesting thing is, so we split the half. We asked the people how much, and then we asked them what they should do, what we should do. Then we told half the sample the right answer and asked them what we should do. And we found a statistically significant increase in support for policies among those who were given good information. So a bit of survey research supporting the proposition that you use it and you learn something, and it tells me what I have to do. Finally, the partisan gap is stunning in our data as well. Thanks a lot. Wonderful stuff. I'm a sociologist, too, so you've got the sociologist trying to convince you to do sociology. But remember, we elect our presidents by the dumbest thing on the planet, a public opinion poll.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, we're now going to open it up for your questions, and if you could just identify yourself when you ask your question. And probably there will be a lot of them, so please try to keep them brief. Okay, here in the back.
Hi, I'm Alex. I work with the Department of Interior, and I have a couple of questions for the first presenter, Dr. Trosnick. How large was your sample size, and when did you ask your question about priorities?
Yeah, the sample in each of these surveys was about 1,000 respondents. And if you know how sampling theory works, 1,000 is pretty big and sufficient to get a lot of precision. You can spend a lot more money and get 2,000 or 3,000, and the results will look almost exactly the same as what you see here. And you asked, when did we ask the question about priorities? We asked it during the fall of 2009. Ah, thank you. Yep, thank you. Oh. Yep, you're using that as a technical term from psychology, I'm assuming. Yeah, it was the very first question of the survey. Yep.
Okay.
Two quick questions. First, for both of you. Will your
And could you identify yourself?
I'm Kevin First from the Global Park Group, advertising PR here in town. Will your top lines or your crosstabs and everything be publicly available?
They're online now, as I said, at the Woods Institute website. No, we haven't done crosstabs.
Okay. But in time, perhaps?
Sure, you can see them. Yeah, we don't spend a lot of time doing that, but yeah.
There's a document that describes this stuff on our website. The top line is, most of the graphs are there. If you want the underlying numbers, you can contact me for the actual numbers, but all the data is there in graphic form.
Related to domestic energy consumption. Is there a feasibility, you think, that the lower population density equates to higher residential areas, larger home sizes, and thus the
So say more about your idea there.
less people, bigger area, bigger houses, more energy use?
Makes sense.
Well, that goes to my use of the GDP per capita per person. The size of the house is really a variable that reflects a preference. So it doesn't necessarily have to be related to density. If you look, and I could take a look, if you look at urban consumption, I bet you would see similar differences. The suburbanization of America is a policy choice. Let me say that again. The suburbanization of America, suburbanization, I can't say it again, right, of America is a policy choice. The residential building codes and community codes are a policy choice. As I like to say, it's illegal, essentially, to walk to the grocery store in half of America, right? Because we zone commercial out of our neighborhoods, and we don't build sidewalks in those neighborhoods, and people just don't like walking down the side of a road. In rural America, where there are no people, it's fine. In suburbanized America, you worry about it. So at that level, I think the outcome reflects policy choices as opposed to the dictates of density. I think the vehicle fleet and the low density of our population is a more important variable when you look at gasoline consumption, and that's why I make that distinction.
Okay, here.
Hi, Brady Phillips with NOAA, and I was just wondering in terms of some of your data in terms of what influences people from one year to another. Have you ever looked at in terms of, does it change from, say, marketing or campaigns of doubt versus, the headlines in newspapers? So in terms of what exactly moves a person in their beliefs from point A to B, or numbers going up and down?
Yeah, thank you. So the question is, what is it that causes changes of opinion in this domain? And we actually have done a bit of work in this area. So my first answer to you is, well, actually, first off, there isn't much change of opinion in this area over this time period, but there certainly is some. And we did do some research looking at the impact of news coverage of climate skeptics in balanced news stories. So you know that news media professionals have often been accused of having a liberal bias, and I think that creates a sensitivity in that community that leads them to always want to have multiple competing points of view on every issue. So you're from NOAA, you know, if some new piece of research comes out of NOAA saying, yep, more evidence that the climate is warming up, reporters have often felt pressure to cover contradictory opinions so that they can't be accused of bias. Now, I showed you in those slides that in recent years, the percent of news stories that have those skeptics in them is very small. It's less than 10%. Nonetheless, those skeptics are present in some of this coverage. And the question is, does it make any difference? Does it impact on people at all? So we did a very simple experiment where we had participants in an internet survey watch a video on their computers of a news story. Half of the participants saw a mainstream scientist talking about scientific findings. The other half saw that same mainstream scientist talking about scientific findings, followed by an economist expressing deep skepticism about the whole thing. And we could then ask both of those groups a series of questions after the video exposure and say, what impact did having the skeptic added to the video have on the answers that people provided? And the answer was substantial impact. Striking about a 12 percentage point drop in the percent of people who said they thought climate change was happening as a result simply of seeing that one skeptic added to the story. So that's the one piece of evidence that we have that suggests that exposure to the skeptical message does in fact influence people's thinking. And a second factor that we found to play in is trust in scientists and trust in the news media. So for people who do trust scientists and the media, when they receive a news story from the media about a scientist, that has impact. For people who are skeptical either about scientists or about the news media, and by the way, news media skepticism is at a recent high at the moment, those stories have less impact than they might otherwise.
I offered the hypothesis that if I were to count the stories as John did on drilling over the time period between when we asked the question first and when we asked it most recently, you would see the number of stories, and I think that is what has resulted in the dramatic increase in the erroneous understanding of the American public, among the American public, of what our share of oil reserves is. So I think that I could do the same thing. I wish we had asked this question more frequently, especially in the middle of the period, but we only did it and so there's no doubt that what gets covered, and obviously, needless to say, we are designing our next survey question in light of the oil in the Gulf to understand how that's going to impact here. But of course, we've already had 90% support for reduction in consumption, so you can't go up much from there. But clearly, I believe the press coverage and the social marketing of this as opposed to the pure PR part of it, or the news coverage, is an important instrument. And why splitting halves as we do is really a good way to learn how to inform the public, not necessarily influence or sway the public.
Okay.
Mark, as David Moulton of the Women's Society, could you just expand a little bit on the slide you have up there? Because you had initially started out noting your disagreement with the theory of price and your favoring codes. But most people look at a slide like that and say, well, yeah, it shows that we can have a good standard of living using a lot less energy. So then the question arises, well, how did Europe get there? And most people think that it's price. So could you just talk a little bit about how you reconcile, how you talk about that?
Well, it's actually both things. If you look at the building codes in Europe, if you look at the fuel economy standards in Europe, they are way beyond what we have here, and they have been for quite some time. If you look at the state of California, and I realize people don't like to look at the state of California, but if you look at the state of California, they have achieved a much lower level of electricity consumption. It turns out Vermont has accomplished exactly the same thing as California, but nobody has seen that graph for California. And if you analyze California, it's 50-50. The analysis in California says it's half price and half standards and appliances. We've done statistical analysis over the period from 1990 to 2007 when we have the data. And if you do a multiple regression technique, you control for all the other stuff, it turns out that standards are the equal of price. And I I said I was not saying you couldn't do price, but if you are trying to move the American people and get policies that will end our oil addiction, to use a famous phrase, and you want to keep their attention, the survey evidence which says that standards are as effective as price, and people will support the standards and not the price increases, maybe that's where you should start. And that's my point of sort of laying this out this way, because there's a way to go here for a significant period of time before you hammer people with price. Price will work. I like to talk about price as the secondary or complementary policy. Here in Washington, they've always got it flipped around. They say, let's raise prices first, and then we'll think about the other things to do. I think we ought to do it the other way. And I think it's true in Europe. You have both price and standards.
Mm-hmm.
I'm from Mount Pleasant, Iowa, and Iowa, we're big corn and soybean people. So I was wondering if you had gotten any sort of feeling for the public opinion on ethanol or biodiesel, agriculture-based energy alternatives.
Yeah, Mark may have. I have not, in the work that we've done, tried to get into alternative sources of energy besides wind, water, solar. And so it's, unfortunately, I haven't got anything to help you on that one.
We have never polled around that choice for a variety of reasons. So I just have, and I haven't seen any public opinion polling around that. I bet if you put the newspaper stories up there, you would see roughly the same thing, that there was a long period of time where there were lots of stories and lots of support. Then there were doubts came out, and if you did that analysis, I think you would see this, similar to what John found with climate change.
Okay, here.
My name is Christopher Krause from the National Environmental Education Foundation. John, that slide you had on that basically illustrated how trust in, I think it was in scientists who study environmental issues, hadn't really waned. But I kind of take a different message from that. I was struck that I think it was 69% either have a lukewarm sense of trust in these scientists or don't trust them at all. So I was, if you have any general comments on that, I'd appreciate that. But also, if you had changed the question to just scientists, do you think you would have gotten a different result? And also the word trust. I think that's kind of did you define trust, or because that has a lot of different connotations to it.
Yep.
You trust their findings, or trying you do trust them personally. So.
Right. Yeah. Well, so we asked about. I believe I'm remembering this right. That we asked about to what degree do you trust the things scientists who study the environment say. And you're absolutely right. There would be ways to fine-tune that wording and see whether you got different results. You could certainly ask about scientists in general. You could ask about scientists who study the environment. You could ask about scientists who study the climate and move in a variety of different directions. Some people have observed the last 10 years or so in Washington as being a time period of a lot of assault on science. And at least it doesn't, according to our data, when we started measuring trust in scientists a long time ago, it doesn't look like there was any decline. But I do agree with you. Speaking as a scientist, it hurt my feelings when I saw these results the first time, because I was very struck that, to me, I thought when this issue was raised originally, what's not to trust about science? But it turns out, I guess maybe I've now come to recognize that the folks who say, no, I don't trust anything they say, that seems extreme. The people who say, I trust everything they say, maybe you got to wonder about those folks. And so a moderate amount or more of trust seems like maybe that's the right place to be, given that science is an evolving enterprise. And there are some, I don't know how many of you heard this, but a few weeks ago there was a headline blared very loudly around the country that people who brush their teeth more than once a day have fewer heart attacks than people who brush their teeth once a day. And that may well be true, and it could be a really major insight, but it's the first study of its sort, apparently. And you'd want to kind of wait, because there are plenty of stories about coffee and pancreatic cancer that then turned out not to be right. And so I think it does kind of make sense to be skeptical about science during the process. But the thing I love about being a scientist is that the enterprise is cumulative, and that if any finding is important, People will attempt to replicate it, and if once we find out whether it replicates, then we know whether to believe it or not. You've seen a lot of evidence here of replication, and the scientific literature is filled with a lot of it as well. So for me personally, I guess I'm maybe not as discouraged by that result as you are, although I'm more discouraged than I would like to be.
Well, the other point would be that generally, and I haven't looked lately, but these days Americans don't trust anybody. And so I would be interesting to see, and in the past I've seen them, the trust in institutions is way down. And I suspect science hasn't fared any worse than any other institution in terms of a general downward trend.
Okay, go ahead.
James Henley, I'm with the Carbon Tax Center. I was interested in the way you pulled the question about cap and trade. You sort of left out the point that a constrained supply, which is what a cap is, does raise prices. And so people get the idea that they're getting something for nothing. And in fact, I sort of got the overall message from your results that I read in the Times yesterday. That people like regulations and they like anything that doesn't really reflect the price. Economists turn around and say, well, the price is actually the most efficient way to get those reductions. And if you do regulations, you're going to see an increase in price, but we don't put a number on it, so we don't see it. So I guess my question is, do you think it's fair to call cap and trade something that doesn't really reflect the price, because it is actually, it's a hidden, volatile, and aggressive tax? And also, because I'm trying to promote the idea of a revenue-neutral carbon tax, do you have any advice about how to frame that so that we can, we're calling our proposal a tax, but in a sense it's not a tax. It's a way to change the relative price of fossil fuels without taking revenue out of the economy.
Yeah, a question I can answer. Great. So in two parts. First of all, I didn't talk about it here, but in this survey and in other surveys we've done, we've incorporated pricing into descriptions, including in descriptions of cap and trade. And one of the most important findings that we have is that when you ask people about for example, if a law were proposed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050, and it would cost your household an increase in $100 per year of energy costs, would you vote for this policy or against the policy, and vary that price amount? What we find is that until the dollar amount hits $200 per year, a majority of Americans support that kind of legislation. Now, let me take this as an opportunity to caution you against some polls that have asked questions that say, would you favor or oppose a policy that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Then you get an answer. And then people who say yes, you say, well, what if it would cost you $10 a month? The problem with a question like that is it doesn't tell you what you're buying for the $10 a month. It doesn't tell you how much benefit you get. And so people could naturally infer, if it cost me $100, that must be a bigger benefit than if it only cost me $5. And maybe $5 isn't enough of a benefit, and I won't favor it at that price. So it's important to specify both what the consumer is getting in exchange for the money. So, and we definitely see a variation in price. In particular, if you're interested in this, take a look at an article that was published in New Scientist magazine a few years ago, where we did experiments using a variant of the methodology called contingent valuation, where we described various policy approaches to greenhouse gas reduction and proposed specific prices to people. And we found that as the price went up, fewer and fewer people were willing to vote for it. So it's an example of people behaving in surveys just as they do in marketplaces. That's reassuring about the survey result. You asked about the idea of making the tax sort of revenue neutral in a way. We explored, actually thanks to Carol's inspiration, when she heard some results some years ago, she suggested some ideas to pursue. And so we explored different ways of framing what to do with the extra tax money. So if a policy raised revenue for the government, for example, if cap and trade were implemented and the permits were auctioned instead of being given out, what would the government do with that money? One possibility that we proposed to the survey respondents was that the money would be used for research to find ways to protect the environment. That didn't help at all. When we told people the money would be used to help poor people, that didn't help at all. When we told people all of the revenue generated by the tax would be returned to all Americans equally as a federal tax refund, that's when we saw a notable increase in support. Where can I find that? Go to that website. Everything we have is... well, sorry, no, that's not in New Scientist. That's on my Woods Institute website.
As I said, we occasionally ask people the amount of, we tell them how much it might cost for more fuel-efficient cars, but we also give them the benefit, and the support for higher standards drops off a little bit when you talk about $2,000 or $3,000, even though you tell them that it will pay back in 2 or 3 years. But it still stays way above 50%. The most interesting thing is if you study the marketplace, people are paying $2,000 or $3,000 more for fuel-efficient cars today. They are buying smaller cars, something Detroit said. They would never buy smaller cars. They would never give up the 6 cylinders. They did in droves, and there was a shift starting as early as 2003. So in the marketplace, the consumers who are assumed to be irrational are actually behaving in a fairly rational fashion. When you ask them the questions phrased with the trade-offs that they can understand, the contingent valuation approaches, they actually hold up pretty well as rational actors.
Go ahead.
Carol, I just wanted to point out, Mike Murphy from the Woods Institute for the Environment. The webpage that John's talking about is actually on the handout that was out front there, second paragraph. All the surveys, other surveys and studies he's mentioned is on that webpage. Some of the questions from his current survey are still not posted because John's still doing the analysis since the data is still hot off the press. So ask a little patience on that front, and eventually we'll get all the questions posted online.
Go ahead, Bob.
Bob Musil, American University.
One might draw the conclusion from all of this that the American public actually supports global warming, understands it, believes in it, and would like legislation. That doesn't happen. But since, for example, New York and California have perhaps 1/6 of the nation's population, but only 4% of the senators, which will leave the Constitution aside right now. Do you poll by states, or do you try to figure out attitudes? You can only take one really dumb state, and I won't name it, to cause a lot of problems in the Senate. So have you done this by state, and what sort of trends might there, or would you do it that way?
Yeah, thank you. That one of the lessons that we learned in the last 2 days of visiting with representatives and their staffs here is that your question is tremendously important. That elected representatives are very attuned to their own constituents in a way that makes it harder for them to find value in national surveys than I expected. And so your question came up constantly in our discussions, and I am happy to tell you that I have a little bit of answer to it. We have looked not state by state, but we have looked at regions of the country, and we've found 2 things. First of all, along the west coast of the United States, California, Oregon, Washington, there's a small bump up in the percentages that I showed you here. So that particular community, for whatever reason, is a little higher than you'd expect just by chance alone. But the rest of the country is essentially flat. There is no region variation notable. So you might imagine that sort of in coal and oil producing states, mining places, that you would see some different opinions on these things. And we don't. It's a remarkably flat pattern. And somebody asked earlier about crosstabs. For those of you who don't know what crosstabs are, what that means is looking at each of the results I showed you separately by demographic groups, comparing men and women and old people and middle-aged and young people and well-educated and less educated. And we kind of got out of the habit of doing that because you find almost no differences across these groups. The one place where you find differences has to do with particular questions and age and parenthood. So older people, if you ask them, how much do you think climate change is going to affect you during your lifetime? They think they're going to be much less affected because they'll be dead by the time the effects happen. Young people are far more likely to say they'll be personally affected. But it turns out the effect is not as big as you might imagine because middle-aged and older people care about their children and grandchildren, and they see the effects on them as being substantial. And so there is actually a muting, and we always see this effect, statistically controlling for everything else. Having children or grandchildren bumps up support for remedial policies. So if anybody told you people are selfish, they're not that selfish.
We find essentially the same thing. With the national random sample of 1,000, the state level is difficult. Although California, you get 100, so you can look at California, but most other states are too small. Regionally, there's no differences. There's no statistically significant differences. We find the income difference on because gasoline is such a big part of the household budget. We find low-income people, ironically, tend to give more pro-policy answers because rationally they understand that more fuel-efficient cars are good for them, and the impact of higher prices and larger bills is more painful. We've just looked at California as 104 in my sample, which is small, and the national press would laugh at it, but actually statistically it's big enough to do stuff. No differences with the national answers.
Terrific. I just wanted to comment too, in consistent with the data that you've just been talking about. EESI has been part of the Sustainable Energy Coalition since 1990, when a group of us formed it. And during the 90s, we did polling every year on a number of these questions, particularly with regard to policies and in terms of ameliorating energy security, and climate issues. And the numbers were all in the high 80s, much as what you were showing here, which is really incredible in terms of that whole long period of consistency. So hopefully this was very informative to you today, and you got it really fresh data, just right out of the field in terms of brand new analysis. I hope this was really helpful to you. All this information, the presentations, the link to the websites will all be on EESI's website, as well as the whole presentation today. So if you've got any questions, please feel free to follow up with us or with our speakers. And thank you all very, very much for coming today. And thank you, John and Mark. Terrific presentations. Really, really interesting.